So hello and welcome to this course entitled Trauma and Literature, where we're looking at Catherine Malabou's book, The New Wounded. So we're just beginning to wind up with this work. We've already had a series of lectures on it. We have located Malabou's position theoretically, philosophically, and also in terms of how she can be a very interesting philosopher and theorist, looking at the convergence, shall we say, between literature and trauma in the way we have studied in this particular course. So as we just begin to wind up with Malabou, the section that I will start with today and hopefully finish is a section which is entitled Identity Without Precedent, which should be on your screen. Now, as we have seen already, there is a very post-structuralist manner in which Malabou looks at plasticity, the brain, the self, identity, etc. So there's a performative quality, there's a plastic quality, and there's obviously a mutable textual quality in Malabou's determinations of these categories. Now, interestingly, she starts with a quotation from a book called A Man with a Shattered World. So this is a book by Alexander Luria. It's a very interesting book, and I do recommend it. And the little sentence which should be on the screen says, "I am a kind of newborn creature." In other words, what kind of identity can emerge out of a zero template? There's no template preceding it. So, and she looks at trauma, she looks at the wound as the phenomenon or as an event which generates this identity without precedent, without a template to draw on. So, in other words, a new plastic self emerges as an epiphenomenon of trauma, right? And obviously, epiphenomenon is something which we consider as a fallout of trauma, the result of trauma, the consequence of trauma, right? So she's looking at the consequentiality of trauma in a way which is very, very post-structuralist, shall we say. So if we can take a look at what she's saying here, which is, again, a very post-structuralist understanding of, trauma. And obviously, she's departing from a classic Freudian understanding of trauma, right? So, and this is something that she talks about in Freud. So there's a quotation from Freud that she mentions only to deconstruct it, and this should be on the screen in page 57. Plasticity for Freud designates the imperishable character of psychic formations. The clearest articulation of this definition of plasticity appears in the essay by Freud, which is Thoughts of the Times on War and Death, right? And this is where Freud defines plasticity in a systematic way. And this is a Freud quotation that Malabou is citing here. It is otherwise with the development of the mind. Here one can describe the state of affairs, which has nothing to compare with, only by saying that it is that in this case every early stage of development persists alongside the later stage, which has arisen from it. Here, succession also involves coexistence, although it is to the same materials that a whole series of transformations has applied. The earlier mental state may not have manifested itself for years, but nonetheless it is so far present that it may at any time again become the form of expression of the forces in the mind, and indeed the only one, as though all later development has been annulled or undone. So this is a classic Freudian understanding of trauma, where Freud talks about how the different states of the mind can coexist together. So in other words, the mind as a form of entanglement of different kinds of mental orders, different kinds of mental situations, and depending on the environment or depending on the situation of the self, any one particular mental state can be foregrounded, can become the dominant form of mentality. And others can just become relegated into unimportant orders. But the important thing here for Freud is the interconnected quality of all the mental states. So Freud says quite clearly in this particular quotation that every mental state is connected to a preceding state, and that to a preceding state, and that just goes on ad infinitum. So in other words, what we are today is a series of experiences that have a cumulative quality, that have a connective quality, and the sort of successive connective quality of mental states is something for Freud is an important state, because what he defines, how he defines it, is the way any one particular mood, any one particular emotion, any one particular mental state can become abruptly foregrounded, can become abruptly the dominant category, which will subsume every other mental state. So that would be an interesting way to look at it. So And as Freud mentions, as you can see in the quotation, any earlier mental state can suddenly resurface. It'll never disappear. It can suddenly resurface in a form of expression of the forces in the mind, and it can become the only one. It can become the superior, the dominant, the hegemonic form, which would put everything else, which will undo all the other categories at that point of time. And now we'll see how Malabou draws on this theory, draws on this template, and also departs from it in a way which is quite deconstructive. And this is what she says, and this should be on the screen on page 58. A careful reading of these assertions shows that the imperishable nature of psychic life does not apply to all mental developments, every life experience, or every event, but only to the fundamental psychic form, the initial form that subsists throughout its developments, even as it undergoes transformation. In other words, there is what modern neuroscience calls the core self, right, or the proto self. That proto self is the fundamental self, and everything else just connects to it, right? And that fundamental psychic form subsists, right? And that is the Freudian understanding of the self that Malabou is citing at the moment. And now she situates plasticity apropos of this. So what is plasticity as defined by Malabou, and obviously, as defined or in relation to the Freudian understanding of the self as having a core proto-self. So if there is a core proto-self, how does plasticity feature? What is the nature, what is the function of plasticity in the way that Malabou is trying to locate it in a Freudian vocabulary? So plasticity must then be understood as a form's ability to be deformed without dissolving, and thereby to persist throughout its various mutations, to resist modification, and to be always liable to emerge anew in its initial state. It is precisely the series of transformations that can always be annulled, so that a unique form can reappear. Precisely and paradoxically, plasticity categorizes both the liability and the permanence of this form. So as we can see, there is a very ambivalent quality about plasticity. And on one hand, plasticity is, it makes the form perishable. It perishes the form, so the form, gets deformed. But then it doesn't stop there. It also reforms in a way which is, just draws on the original template. So, appearance and reappearance are almost simultaneous categories in plasticity, right? And that's something which Malabou is quite clearly underlining, the textual, mutable quality of plasticity, right? So, and that paradox of plasticity makes the form a liability as well as something which is permanent, right? So the form constantly mutates, so it is always disappearing, but it's also reappearing in a way which is drawing on the original template. So as we can see, there is destructive plasticity, but also there is regenerative plasticity, and that's something Malabou had mentioned before as well. Okay, so. And of course, she has another quotation right after this, which is the extraordinary, and again, this is Freud, the extraordinary plasticity of mental development is not unrestricted as regards direction. It may be described as a special capacity for involution, for regression, since it may well happen that a later and higher state of development, once abundant, cannot be reached again. But the primitive stages can always be re-established. The primitive mind is, in the fullest meaning of the word, imperishable. And this obviously connects to Freud's understanding of libido, desire, and everything else. So the whole idea of the primitive self, which is appetitive in quality, that is just there as a permanent presence, whereas all the other forms, which are plastic in quality, can be perished. Right? So Freud has a very interesting, almost a dualistic understanding of the permanent and the impermanent, the permanent as the primal animalistic self, the primitive self, and the textual mutable one, which is the more cultural, the more extended self, which can appear as well as disappear. So as we can see, this persistent form is the primitive form. The notion of primitivity thus gives content to this concept of the initial form of psychic life. The primitive and what does not descend from it is imperishable. So this is what I meant when I said in Freud's vocabulary, in Freud's understanding or theory of the mind, there is a proto-core self which is imperishable in quality, right? And that proto-core self is the primitive self, the animalistic self, the appetitive self. And that's why Freud places so much importance on libido, on hunger, on other forms of bodily appetites. And obviously the word savage comes in an interesting way as well. Savage as the signifier of primitivity. That's something which is always there in the human self, and everything else can just be peeled on and peeled off, depending on the situation. The primitive for Freud has two meanings, each rigorously articulated in relation to the other. On one hand, the primitive is a savage, also called prehistoric man, who subsists within each of us. On the other hand, as in the preceding passage, the primitive designates the primitive psyche, that is, both the general psychic form in which the savage survives within us and a particular psychic style of the survival, the constitutively unique character of the individual's childhood. So again, as we can see, childhood plays a very important role in Freud's theory of the mind. So there are two kinds of primitive primitive concepts that Freud articulates according to Malabou. One is a savage, the primitive man, the prehistoric man, the uncultured man, the accultured man, or the pre-cultured man, and the other is a primitive psyche, which is the fundamental psychic form, which the savage survives within us, in which the mental state in which the savage self survives in us as a residual presence, and the psychic pattern for that survival, and that the constitutively unique character of the individual's childhood. So childhood for Freud is a very important concept, because childhood is reflective of the primitive quality of the human self, the survival instinct, the selfish instinct, the libidinal instincts. All these instincts play a very important role in Freud's understanding of the psyche. So psychic plasticity designates the combined persistence within us of prehistoric man and the child, and always the open possibility, of the imminent return, right? So, as we can see, there's a lot of cultural studies done on the child savage, or the savage child. There is a degree of connection to be made there. The connection could be one of innocence, but also one of amorality, right? So the child does not know morality, neither does a savage know morality, because morality as a cultural concept is obviously constructed of different kinds of knowledge narratives, and the primitive self doesn't know that, is sort of immune to that culturation, as is a child, right? So as you can see, this is what Freud talks about in terms of plasticity. So there is a dualistic model in Freud's understanding of plasticity. On one hand, there is a primitive, imperishable self. On the other hand, that same primitive, imperishable self, it controls the other plastic forms of psychic life, in terms of the patterns appearing and reappearing. Okay, so we'll skip a little bit from here, and we will come to the next section. And then we can see how Malabou talks about memory loss in terms of Alzheimer's disease, etc., and how that's important, because in the case of Alzheimer, very quickly, in the case of Alzheimer, the knowledge of the self's knowledge of itself disappears. So in other words, you don't quite know who you are, and that connection with the environment disappears as well. And that's something which obviously becomes destructive in quality. Okay, so we come to the section in the book, this is page 152, which should be on the screen, and the subsection is titled Traumatic Metamorphosis. So as we can see, there is a metamorphosis quality about trauma, in the sense that what happens post-trauma is sometimes fundamentally different in terms of what happened, how the subject was pre-trauma. So, we just spent some time looking at Freud's understanding of the proto-core self, and we see how trauma can actually unsettle that proto-core self to a certain extent. And this should be on the screen. This is page 152. The specificity of the traumatic event thus inheres in this metamorphic power. So, one of the conditions of trauma is the metamorphic power, the ability to transform the subject, obviously in a negative, nihilistic way. The traumatic event, in a certain sense, invents its subject. So there's a regenerative quality about trauma, in the sense that it creates a different subject, which is different fundamentally from the earlier subject. The past of the traumatized individual changes becomes another past, which, when it is not pure and simply destroyed or consigned to oblivion, accordingly, a new subject enters the scene in order to assume this past that never took place. So there's a sense of a false past that is created, a past which is never there. So we can find that in a case of extreme trauma situations, the subject invents the past. The subject is connected to a past which was never there. And so this idea of the false past becomes interesting, because what that also means is that trauma creates a sense of pseudo-memory or pseudo-remembrance, remembrance of things which were never there, which never happened. It is no longer the same subject who anticipates himself and sees himself die. Separation can no longer be anticipated, but it does occur precisely in metamorphosis. And then there are some philosophers that Malabou is mentioning. Croc, for example. Croc insists on the lasting modification of the personality that follows the experience of catastrophe, a modification that leads them to propose the concept of the traumatoneurotic personality. Further, the personalities of today's neurosis are constitutional. The traumatoneurotic personality is only constituted through trauma at any age. It is what becomes of the personality of the patient under the impact of trauma. So, as we can see, this is something we may have mentioned at the beginning of this work, and that is Malabou looks at trauma as an event in a way that Alan Bado does, for instance, something which changes, the before and the after, and the seamless continuation between the past and the present gets interrupted by this particular event. And obviously, in the case of trauma, the event is a negative, destructive event. So the subject's connection to the past becomes interrupted, sometimes permanently, right? And this permanent interruption becomes a problem in terms of the subject's awareness of themselves as a subject, right? And that becomes obviously a self-reflexive crisis. This modification of an identity of patients is a long-established fact of observation. Simmel already spoke of a change in the soul and an entombment of the person under the effect of the accident. So we can have more metaphysical understanding of this metamorphosis. Like, for instance, some people might say there's a change in the soul. The person changes so fundamentally that the thinking subject changes, the soul subject changes of the person. But the psychoanalytic model, even as it accounts for the fraction and its overwhelming effect on the personality, does not postulate that the personality has been changed. If Freud admits that obvious fact that accident can severely and permanently damage the psyche, he never presents the formation of the new identity as a discontinuous process, a leap, a phenomenon that is no less unforeseen or unexpected than the catastrophe itself. For him, traumas and wounds do not seem capable of creating ex nihilo, a post-traumatic identity. There's always a certain psychic continuity between what comes before and what comes after the wound. The subject remains what he is within his very alienation. However, this very continuity is what will be called into question within contemporary neurological debate. So, as we can see, one of the key things in this particular book is a deconstruction of Freud. So there's a lot of Freud scholarship which is offered, but there are certain fundamental tenets of Freudian psychoanalysis which are called into question. And one of the key tenets is this, the idea of the continuous subject. So for Freud, as we have seen already, just a section before this, there is a proto self which never disappears. There's a core self which never disappears. No matter what the event is, no matter what the trauma is, there's always this very fundamental self which is retained in a very almost stubbornly, shall we say. Whereas, as Malabou is examining and as she's corroborating through, empirical evidence from contemporary neuroscience, there seems to be a very direct discontinuity between the subject before and after the trauma. So in the sense that the subject's connection to the past changes so fundamentally that it's no longer can be seen as a proto-subject, as an unchanged, imperishable subject. So the fantasy of imperishability that is there in Freudian psychoanalysis is called into question by Malabou here. And what we have instead is a more plastic idea of the self that's something which can be mutated at a very fundamental level. And this very fundamental mutation is something that Malabou seems to acknowledge and also articulate in this theory. Right, so there's this very fundamental departure from Freud that Malabou is is offering over here in terms of offering a model of trauma which can change or metamorphose the fundamental subject in a way which is discontinuous with any understanding of or any access to the subject's past, right? So whereas for Freud there's a fundamental continuity which constitutes the core proto-self, whereas for Malabou, trauma is capable, so she almost gives an agency to trauma in a certain sense. Trauma is capable of, completely destroying the subject in a way which is unrecognizable. So the subject cannot recognize themselves anymore post-trauma, right? So, and this is what she mentions, the idea, the final sentence of this page, as you can see, the formation, resulting in the formation of an identity without origin and without memory. So there is the idea of the memoryless subject, the idea of the originless subject is something which Malabou offers as a very clear and dramatic and direct departure from Freud. So for Freud, there's always a continuity. No matter what the trauma is, there's always this fundamental subject, a fundamental personality which is unchangeable or imperishable. And as Malabou says, there may have been occasions that Freud had hinted at a sense of discontinuity but never spelled it out. Whereas modern neuroscience tells us, and Malabou is obviously drawing on that in terms of mapping a more post-structuralist understanding of the self, that there could be an identity which is formed. One is one without origin and without memory. So the idea of the memoryless man or the originless man becomes very, very important in Malabou's study. And this is obviously produced by destructive plasticity that is not interested or only falsely interested in itself. Rehabilitating the event is thus a matter of taking into account the discontinuity produced by the traumatizing event and of its destructive power to transform identity. Gage was no longer Gage. So some of you would know the idea, the very famous case study of Phineas Gage, a railway worker who suffered an accident and the splinter hit his head, and then obviously he went into coma, lost his consciousness, but then he recovered. He was medically fit to walk again, but then it was a blunt force trauma, and then we realized, his contemporary people, his colleagues realized, his family realized that there's a very fundamental difference in what he was after the accident. His ability to emote, his ability to connect, his ability to be receptive to what was the familiar world around him, that changed in such a fundamental way that people started saying Gage was no longer Gage. So it's almost as if a different person has emerged out of it. And this is exactly Malabou's point, that a different subject can emerge at a very fundamental level out of this event of trauma. Okay, so and this is a quotation with which she ends. If we ask patients about the experiences and these changes of personality, we observe that this is no metaphor. The patients find themselves really changed, and they no longer recognize themselves as they were before. And this is not simply due to the fact that they're sad about having undergone a difficult event. It is more profoundly on the level of the entire way of living that they come to realize that a new being is within them, a being whom they do not recognize. So it is at a very fundamental level of cognitive crisis as well, right? So the patients post-trauma, the sufferers of trauma, the survivors of trauma, they sometimes fail to recognize themselves and the world around them. So it's almost as if a different person comes up, which can be an imposter to the, a lookalike, but an imposter to the original subject. So there's no connection at all to the original subject. So this is a very key difference that Malabou is offering, right? So that's something which we need to take into account. Okay, this is page 160, and this is a very interesting section because Malabou talks about the idea of coolness. And by coolness, she mentions, she refers to the subject who is unaffected by anything. So the sense of being indifferent or unsensitized to anything or any stimuli around themselves. And this is the thing on the screen at the moment where she talks about, and she refers to the work of Antonio Damasio to a large extent. It now appears that the impact of social warmth is just as forceful as a brain lesion and no less violent than being struck by a bullet or an iron bar. So, and this is where it gets really interesting. She talks about the convergence to be made between trauma as a medical event, as a physical event, and trauma as a social event. So social war can have sometimes the same traumatic effect let's say compared to being hit by a bullet or being hit by an iron bar, which is a blunt force trauma, obviously. Even if such blows do not always occur as sudden events, but tend to be more continuous or harassing, their sense, like that of the brain lesion, remains dissimulated beneath an absence of sense. Social conflict without dialectic as anonymous as a natural catastrophe, and as an absence that reveals the very coolness of the political and the social today. So this coolness has a nihilistic quality to it. This coolness has a disturbing detachment to it, and that's something that Malabou is picking on. Damasio affirms, and this is a quotation from Damasio, developmental sociopaths or psychopaths are well known to all of us from the daily news. They steal, they rape, they kill, they lie. They're often smart. The threshold at which the emotions kick in when they do so is so high that they appear unflappable and are, from their self-appearance, unfeeling and uncaring. They're the very picture of the cool head we are told to keep in order to do the right thing. In cold blood, and to everyone's obvious disadvantage, including their own, sociopaths often repeat their crimes. They are, in fact, another example of a pathological state in which a decline in rationality is accompanied by a diminution or absence of feeling. Right, so Damasio's work is interesting, and Malabou obviously is drawing on it quite a bit, because Damasio talks about the equation between emotion and cognition, or how emotions actually help in the decision-making process, in the rational decision-making process. Now, what Damasio says over here is, that the whole idea of the psychopath or the sociopath, one of the fundamental features of those unfortunate people is the fact that their ability to emote goes away, their ability to connect emotionally goes away. So there's this coolness which comes in, and that makes them unfeeling or uncaring. In other words, the biggest causality in this particular situation is empathy. So the empathy goes away, the ability to empathize goes away. And obviously empathy has a medical cerebral quality, and equally empathy has an extended social enactive quality. So the causality of empathy, or the crisis of empathy, operates at both levels: the medical level, the embedded level, as well as the more extended and inactive level. And that's something that Malabou highlights, drawing obviously on Damasio. So reflecting upon trauma today obviously constitutes a reflection on the nature of this threshold. So this threshold in which emotions come in for psychopaths is an interesting concept, the liminal quality in which emotions get in, and how they overwhelm the subject in a way. Difficulty letting oneself be touched as the evil of our times. The paradoxical result of being wounded. So, and she's trying to make the connection between how this idea of indifference, or being indifferent to whatever's happening around us, has almost become a social phenomenon. Given our lifestyle, given how we're encouraged to live in isolation, the very high premium placed on privacy and individuality, they all make this they all resulted in this industry of untouchability, or industry of indifference. So you're not touched by anything, you're not affected by anything, and that becomes cool in both senses. Cool as being stylish, fashionable, and also cool as being detached. So there's this very interesting play of coolness over here. To be wounded, indeed, is to be touched, struck by a blow, touche, as one says in a duel. So she's using a duel metaphor. So if you get touched by someone in a duel, you said touche, which means I got touched, so that's a score. To touch thus means precisely to wound, but the touching of the wound today has generated an inability to feel touching, an inability to be touched effectively, which is the sign that one has been touched, that is wounded. So this becomes really paradoxical, and what she's saying here is the biggest wound of modern life today is the absence of wound, or the absence of the ability to be wounded, or the ability to be touched. So she's looking at the connection between touch and wound. So if you're wounded by something, that means you're sensitive to a certain situation. Now, what happens in this modern life of isolation and individuality and privacy is, the disappearance of empathy, the disappearance of affect becomes interesting, because that makes you more and more immune, shall we say, to empathy and affect, and that makes you more and more outside of this touchable parameter, and that makes you, a psychopath in a sense that, which is almost medical in quality. So the Malabou defines the modern condition as an inability to be wounded, and that is paradoxically the new wounded, which is also the title of the book, the coolness, the detachment from stimuli around us. And we see how this can be comparable, interestingly, to the text which we just finished, which is Mrs. Dalloway, Virginia Woolf, because at several points in the novel, Septimus tells the reader, we are obviously inhabiting his mind, that he cannot feel, he cannot emote, he cannot connect emotionally to anything around him, and that is a problem. That is the biggest problem that he has. So I'll just wind up with this bit. What knowledge resides in this coolness? Difficult to explain by recourse to an immanent drive of destruction, impossible to associate with a determinate libidinal investment. The post-traumatic state is a gaping wound that appears on all the battlefields of contemporary society, a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. It inscribes the enigma of his event upon the global stage. So I'll stop at this point, but we see how Malabou begins to use theatrical, performative metaphors. The global stage is such, with modern consumerism, with high capitalism, where you just keep consuming things. You're trained to be unaffected by anything, and that is a new wonder. That is a new battlefield of contemporary society, which is also paradoxically a signifier of sophistication. The more sophisticated you are, the more consumed you are, the more prestigious you are as a consumer. The less you feel for anything around you, because you're just so satisfied as a consuming subject. Now, this is a post-traumatic stress state and current contemporary situation. It's a gaping wound, which is to say it produces normal reactions to abnormal situation. Like you see something happening in front of you, an accident, an event, an injury, and you just stay normal. And this coolness is paradoxically, or the absence of wound, the absence of being touched, the absence of being affected, is the biggest wound in modern society. And obviously Malabou is making a brilliant, sweeping, brilliant, fascinating connection between consumerism, cultural capitalism, and obviously with trauma, not just as a medical situation, not just as a medical state, but also as an extended social event, which is consuming all of us in different degrees. So I stop at this point today, and we will continue, and we'll hopefully finish this fascinating text of Catherine Malabou in the next session. Thank you for your attention.